Sometimes historians, when drawing up lists of the worst rulers of Spain, come to the same result. One name always ends up in first place. All the scholars who studied his reign agree with this judgment. On the Spanish throne there was never a more vile, more cruel, and more sexually perverted king. But what is usually known about him is only the tip of the iceberg. Everything said about dynastic marriages, noble families, and the dignity of the European crown was a carefully built myth, created to hide the dreadful truth. Ferdinand VII did not simply rule Spain. He turned the royal palace into a den where such sexual depravity dominated that even the most infamous brothel keeper would have blushed. Before becoming known as El Rey Felon, the king criminal, he was a prince with physical ugliness and sexual weakness, so much that his own mother-in-law in her letters described him as not even a man. This is one of the few documented cases in European history where we have several testimonies, from royal doctors, foreign diplomats, and even from the victims themselves. They all reported the same terrifying anatomical reality, which decided the fate of the whole nation. What you will now hear will completely change your idea of royal power. It is both the most pitiful and the most frightening story of sexual dysfunction ever recorded in the chronicles of monarchy. So let us move to one wedding night in 1819, so shameful that even Pope Pius was forced to intervene. October 1819, the royal palace in Madrid. The princess, frightened, trembled in her room. Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony, raised in a convent, was so innocent that she thought children were found in cabbage. She waited for her new husband. She was not told anything about what was supposed to happen on the wedding night. Her German servants, too shy to speak, only dressed her in white and left her alone, hands tightly clenched. The door opened, but not a fairy tale prince entered. It was a 35-year-old man, sickly and bloated, with thick protruding lips and eyes like a predator. And what terrified the young bride was not only his appearance. Ferdinand VII suffered from such a terrible condition that modern medicine still cannot explain it. Macrogenitosomia. In simple words, his sexual organ was monstrously huge, but not in the way one might imagine. The French writer Prosper Mérimée, who questioned the servants present that night, described it in dreadful detail. Thin like a wick at the base, thick like a fist at the end, and as long as a billiard cue. Imagine being a 16-year-old girl raised in a convent, suddenly facing such a sight. The young queen looked at him, jumped from the bed, and ran away in fear. Worse still, Ferdinand, drunk with wine and lust, ran after her. Imagine a 35-year-old obese king chasing his teenage bride around the bedroom. The girl was quick. The king was not. Furious at such an insult, Ferdinand rushed out of the room completely naked, showing his deformity, and began shouting at the queen's attendants. He called them whores and scoundrels, demanding that they prepare the young queen for him in 15 minutes. Those unfortunate women, including her own sister-in-law, tried to explain to the terrified girl what awaited her. Their words only made her fear greater. When Ferdinand returned, ready to fulfill his duty, he was met by a smell that no perfume could hide. The young queen, in complete horror, had lost control of her bowels. The King of Spain, in all his grotesque form, found his wedding bed stained. He shouted that queen stank and stormed out, refusing to touch his bride again for more than a week. But this was only the beginning of Maria Josefa's nightmare. To understand why the wedding night went so catastrophically wrong, we must look at what Ferdinand was hiding under his royal clothes. Several doctors who examined him left detailed notes. Dr. José María de la Fuente wrote, "His Majesty has genitals so abnormally large that normal relations are impossible without causing serious injuries to his partner. And it was not only the size. The shape itself was an abnormality of nature. Remember Mérimée's description? Thin at the base, swollen at the end, like a medieval torture device. It was not a gift. It was a curse that followed Ferdinand from his first marriage at the age of 17. Do you want to know how terrible it was? Let me tell you about that first wedding night. In 1802, young Prince Ferdinand married his cousin, Maria Antonia of Naples. On their wedding night, as written in Maria Antonia's letters, Ferdinand only stared at his bride and awkwardly licked her, without knowing what to do next. He literally did not know how sexual relations worked. For 11 months, this marriage remained unconsummated. The prince became aroused. He tried to lie with his wife, but nothing happened. He physically could not understand how to perform it. His anatomy was so abnormal that the simplest act of reproduction became an impossible riddle. Maria Antonia's mother, Queen Maria Carolina of Naples, wrote increasingly desperate letters. "My daughter cries every night. The prince feels nothing. Attempts to excite him are useless. There is no pleasure and no result. This situation is strange and tragic for everyone near him." Finally, the royal confessor had to interfere. A Catholic priest had to sit with the future king of Spain and explain to him in detail how to have relations with his wife. Shame spread through the European courts. The Spanish heir was considered a sexual impotent, a physical freak who could not fulfill the simplest marital duty. When he finally managed to do it almost a year later, the result was catastrophic. Maria Antonia suffered 2 miscarriages, most likely because of internal injuries, and died at the age of 21. Her body was destroyed by her husband's deformity. But here is the most disgusting part. When Ferdinand finally understood how to perform sex, he became obsessed with it. The death of his first wife in 1806 freed him from marriage, but it also released something monstrous. A prince who could not yet be king, but who could not stop. When Ferdinand returned to power in 1814, after the defeat of Napoleon, he was 30 years old. He was sexually unsatisfied and intoxicated by absolute power. Then came a decade of debauchery, which would make even Caligula blush. Every night the king secretly left the palace wearing a dark cloak. His destination was the most infamous brothel in Madrid. His favorite brothel was managed by a madam named Pepa la Malaguine. The place was so scandalous that respectable people crossed to the other side of the street not to pass by. But Ferdinand did not go there alone. He gathered a company of young nobles, just as morally corrupt as himself. Together they turned Madrid's red light district into their personal playground. And here everything became even more perverted. Ferdinand, once humiliated by his ugliness, now turned it into his pride. Many witnesses described the same scene. The King of Spain, drunk with cheap wine, called his companions to contests of size. Each man exposed himself and they literally compared. Ferdinand always won. His friends even gave him the nickname El Bien Dotado, the well-endowed. The king walked through these brothels, showing his grotesque anatomy, boasting of his victories. But boasting was not the worst. Ferdinand had a special fetish that revealed the depth of his perversion. According to his own words, recorded by Count José María de Villalobos, the king said, "They leave my bed certain that no other man can give them such pleasure as I do. And what I like most after I have finished is to collect the cloths stained with the proof of their innocence." The King of Spain collected blood-stained sheets of virgins whom he deflowered. He kept them as trophies. It was not a medieval custom. It was a personal fetish, a perversion to which he devoted himself as other kings devoted themselves to collecting works of art. While his second wife, ironically, created the Prado Museum, Ferdinand collected evidence of his conquests. But prostitutes from Pepa la Malaguine's brothel were not his only victims. While traveling through Spain, Ferdinand left behind broken women. A widow in Aranjuez, a peasant in Sicily, servants in the palace who could not refuse their king. Each encounter added another exhibit. Each bloody rag was another trophy in his chamber of horrors. Meanwhile, Spain was collapsing. While Ferdinand spent the nights comparing genitals and gathering virgin's blood, his country lost its entire American empire. Thousands of liberal reformers were executed. The economy collapsed. But the king did not care. He had brothels to visit, women to break, and trophies to collect. This was the same man who married 3 more times. For the 3 women who became wives of the King of Spain, marriage meant a nightmare beyond imagination. In 1816, Ferdinand needed an heir. His decision was to marry his niece. Maria Isabel of Braganza was 19 years old. She was shy and Portuguese. 3 big flaws in the eyes of the Spanish court. And Maria Isabel lacked what her husband valued most: dignity. While Ferdinand continued his nightly visits to the brothel, she quietly founded the Prado Museum and opened the Royal Academy for Women Artists. She tried to bring culture into a court drowning in debauchery. Ferdinand hardly noticed. For him, she was nothing more than a mother, a vessel for the heirs he so desperately needed. In 1818, she finally became pregnant. And here Ferdinand's story turned from grotesque comedy into pure horror. When Maria Isabel went into labor, complications appeared immediately. The child was stuck in the womb. The queen was dying. Royal doctors faced the choice: save the mother or save the child. Ferdinand gave the order without hesitation: save the child. Cut her if necessary. What followed was witnessed by 12 people, and all of them left matching testimonies. Surgeons began an emergency cesarean. Remember, it was 1818. No anesthesia, only alcohol and opium. They cut into the queen's abdomen, believing she was unconscious. But she was not. In the middle of the procedure, Maria Isabel's eyes opened, and she screamed with a cry that echoed through the palace. She was conscious, fully aware that they were cutting into her womb. Surgeons, panicking, continued their atrocity while the queen writhed in agony. The child had already died hours earlier. Maria Isabel bled out on the operating table. Her final moments were filled with unimaginable suffering, sacrificed for a child who never lived. She was only 21. Her sister publicly blamed Ferdinand for her death. Rumors in the palace claimed his deformity had caused the complications. Others said his syphilis, a gift from countless brothel visits, was to blame. But Ferdinand felt no guilt. Within a year, he was already seeking a new wife. He still needed an heir. If Maria Isabel's death was a tragedy, what happened to Ferdinand's third wife was so shameful that even the Pope could not remain silent. Do you remember Maria Josefa, who humiliated herself on her wedding night? That was only the beginning of her nightmare. After the disaster of their wedding night, Ferdinand refused to touch his teenage bride for a full week. When he finally returned to her bed, she resisted with astonishing force. This girl, raised in a convent to be meek and obedient, turned into a wildcat when faced with her husband's assaults. She bit, scratched, and kicked him so hard that the king ran from the room. But resistance could not last forever. Ferdinand was king. Maria Josefa was his property. And so he tried another way: patience. Every night he came into her room. Every night she prayed for honor while he tried to seduce her. The queen had one strong weapon: ignorance. She truly believed that babies came from cabbage. When Ferdinand tried to explain the facts of life, she accused him of lying, saying he only wanted to deceive her into committing a deadly sin. God could not create such a disgusting act, she said. You are testing my virtue with false words. Weeks and months went by. Ferdinand, the man who always bragged about his sexual victories, could not consummate with his own wife. The court whispered. Foreign envoys reported to their rulers that the King of Spain was being rejected by a child bride. Finally, Ferdinand used his last resort. He wrote to Pope Pius VII. The old Italian pope, who had survived Napoleon and thought nothing could surprise him, received a letter that surely made him question his faith. The King of Spain, defender of Catholic belief, asked the Holy Father to convince his wife to have marital relations. The answer of the Pope remains in the Vatican archives. It is considered a masterpiece of church diplomacy. His Holiness explained gently that marital relations are not only permitted, but also commanded by God. It was Maria Josefa's sacred duty to give birth to an heir. To deny her husband would be to deny the will of God. But even the Pope's letter did not solve the problem. Maria Josefa agreed to submit, but only with strict conditions. She would recite the rosary completely before each act. She would keep her eyes shut through the whole process and think of the Virgin Mary to preserve her purity. Imagine Ferdinand, the absolute monarch of Spain, with power over life and death of millions. And yet, in bed, his teenage wife lay beside him, whispering Ave Maria, full of grace, while he tried to finish the marriage. According to witnesses, these were the most neurotic relations in monarchy history. Maria Josefa lay motionless like a corpse, lips moving in silent prayer, while Ferdinand tried to produce an heir. The same king who collected virgins' blood as trophies was begging his own wife for any sign of desire. They spent 10 years in this marital purgatory. 10 years of rosaries before intercourse. 10 years without a child. When Maria Josefa died in 1829 at age 25, officially from fever, the whole court breathed with relief. Ferdinand had failed again. 3 wives, 2 dead, no legal heir. At 45, tired from decades of debauchery, Ferdinand had his final chance. This time he found a queen as clever as himself. Maria Cristina of Bourbon Sicily knew what she was facing. Unlike his earlier wives, she was ready. At 23, she was beautiful, intelligent, and very pragmatic. She was also Ferdinand's niece, since incest was the only Bourbon tradition he respected. But Maria Cristina had studied the failures of those before her. She understood that the birth of an heir was not only politics. It was also a practical problem. And the solution came from an unexpected place, the royal doctor Antonio Hernandez. After examining the king's anatomy and reviewing the medical notes from his earlier marriages, the doctor reached a remarkable conclusion. The issue was not only Ferdinand's size. It was also the physics of the matter. Think of it this way. If you are trying to plant a seed, but the tool is too large for the garden, you must either change the tool or the seed. Since Ferdinand could not be changed, they needed another solution. Dr. Hernandez's answer was simple yet ingenious. He ordered the royal craftsman to create a special pillow, una almohadilla, made from the finest silk and filled with down. But it was more than a pillow. In its center was a precisely measured opening, with a depth of exactly 4 centimeters. The idea was clear. The pillow acted as a shield, preventing the internal injuries that had followed his earlier attempts at producing heirs. Maria Cristina introduced this solution to her husband with the skill of a careful diplomat. She presented it not as proof of his deformity, but as a medical requirement for the safe birth of heirs. Ferdinand's pride, always his weakness, accepted this version. Their first night using the device, according to reports, was clumsy. Ferdinand, who had always bragged about his size, now had to submit to limitations. Maria Cristina, always practical, treated it like any other royal protocol, a necessary duty for the sake of the crown. But it worked. 3 months later, Maria Cristina was with child. The entire court was stunned. Would this pregnancy, like the others before, end in blood and death? On October 10, 1830, the canons of Madrid announced the event. Queen Maria Cristina gave birth to a healthy daughter, the future Isabella II. 2 years later, she delivered a second girl, Luisa Fernanda. At last, Ferdinand had his heirs. It had taken 4 wives, 2 deaths, 1 papal letter, and a specially designed sexual pillow. But the birth of Isabella created a new dilemma. The Salic law of Spain, borrowed from France, prohibited women from inheriting the crown. Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, expected to succeed. But Ferdinand, who had literally engineered his heirs, would not let legal tradition stop him. In a move that threw Spain into civil war, Ferdinand issued the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, overturning the old law so his daughter could inherit. When he died in 1833, his sexual condition left one last legacy: the First Carlist War, a brutal conflict that killed hundreds of thousands. And all of it because a king with a monstrous body finally learned to use a pillow. But we must return to those trophies Ferdinand once spoke of, his collection of bloody fabrics, for here his depravity reached its deepest darkness. After his death in 1833, Maria Cristina ordered a secret inventory of the king's belongings. What they discovered defied belief. Inside a cedar chest, wrapped in silk, lay dozens of square cloths, each carefully labeled with date and name. Carmen, house servant, March 1821. Isabella, palace maid, January 1823. Maria, widow of Van, September 1824. The king had not exaggerated. He truly collected these dark souvenirs for almost 20 years. Each square of fabric represented a woman, some submissive, others defiant, who had endured a particular form of Ferdinand's cruelty. But the collection also revealed something the court had long suspected. The dates were clustered around major events. After each political disaster, after every crushed liberal uprising, after each execution he commanded, Ferdinand added new trophies to his chest one by one. Violence in the throne room echoed as violence in the bedroom. The man who signed death sentences by day gathered innocent blood by night, as if the repression of political resistance and the destruction of women's innocence were two sides of the same diseased coin. One entry shocked the investigators above all. Anna, 15 years old, daughter of Colonel Bermudez, February 1823. Colonel Bermudez was one of the liberal officers executed after a failed constitutional revolt. His daughter Anna came to the palace to beg for her father's life. She left with her father dead, her innocence shattered, and her name recorded forever in Ferdinand's grotesque archive. This was not simply a king using his rank for pleasure. It was systematic predation, sex as an instrument of political terror. The liberals Ferdinand could not hang. He humiliated through their daughters, their wives, their sisters. The complete list was never made public. Maria Cristina, showing more wisdom than her late husband ever had, ordered the entire collection burned. But not before several courtiers saw it and wrote down what they witnessed. Their testimonies aligned perfectly. It was too consistent to dismiss as palace gossip. We know Ferdinand kept these rags. We know he labeled them. We know he linked them to moments of political repression. What we do not know is how many women were destroyed to create this grotesque museum. Surviving notes mention dozens. The truth was almost certainly worse, because predators do not display their failures. For each fabric in that chest, how many women fought back? How many managed to flee? How many were silenced before they could speak? We will never know. Ferdinand carried those trophies with him to the grave, along with the names of victims whose only crime was catching the eye of a king who confused power with permission. When Ferdinand VII died on September 29, 1833, Spain hardly mourned. His own brother declared war at once. His daughter would face repeated civil wars, defending the throne he had practically engineered. His widow quickly married a common guard, bringing one last disgrace to the crown. But Ferdinand's real legacy was not political. It was personal. He transformed the Spanish monarchy from a sacred institution into a dirty jest. Every king after him bore the stain. Every royal marriage carried suspicion. His daughter Isabella II inherited not only his crown but his appetites. Her scandalous liaisons and rumors of nymphomania eventually led to her overthrow in 1868. The Bourbon dynasty that Ferdinand had literally constructed collapsed in disgrace, toppled by his own bloodline. Think again of that pillow. The king was so deformed that human reproduction required engineering. The monarchy was so desperate for heirs that it turned the royal bed into a medical experiment. That pillow, now lost, symbolizes everything corrupt in Ferdinand's reign. Power distorted into ugliness, legitimacy hanging by a thread, or by a carefully drilled hole in silk. The final irony is cruel. Ferdinand VII is remembered not for triumphs or noble acts, but for his grotesque body and the misery it caused. He longed to be el deseado, the desired one. Instead, he became a warning tale, proof that power without humanity creates monsters. Every historian who studies his reign reaches the same verdict.